You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Over the next 2 years, the Ministry of Defence say they plan to cut 29,000 military personnel and 25,000 civilian staff from the British Armed Forces. The Army is bearing the brunt of the cuts, losing around 19,000 soldiers, while the Royal Navy and the RAF will each lose about 5,000 posts. The government say it has to reduce the size of the armed forces to tackle the massive defence budget deficit it inherited from the previous Labour government. The cuts will bring the Army's numbers down from 101,000 to 82,000, half the size it was during the Cold War era and its lowest level since Britain fought Napoleon. Critics, including Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary, say the losses will have an impact on the military's capabilities. Well, joining me to discuss the impact of the British Army defence cuts is Colonel Richard Kemp, a former British commander in Afghanistan. Richard Norton Taylor is The Guardian's defence and security writer. And Allan Mallinson is a former brigadier-general and now defence commentator for The Times and author of The Making of the British Army. Allan, we'll begin with you. Will this army now be too small?
Well, too small for what? No one could actually answer the question, what is the army for? For the first time in history, we don't have a major existential threat to the nation. We don't have an internal security problem that needs an army. And we don't need troops to advance our material wealth overseas, defend colonies and expand. So it's there for contingencies. It's an insurance policy. Who can say how big it's got to be? You've just got to look at the capabilities that it has, hope that it's got all the capabilities that might be needed for whatever is thrown at it, and then you patch something up on the day. There's a question also that concerns me principally, is this rather indefinable idea of a critical mass. The British Army has always been small compared with all other armies. It's always been a professional army. It's never had conscription outside major war. You mentioned the Napoleonic Wars. We never once resorted to conscription during those wars. If it's a small army, it needs to keep its qualitative edge, and it needs a certain size to be able to do that. I don't know whether 82,000 is too small, but I have my doubts.
Colonel Richard Kemp, is this so-called insurance policy going to be too small?
Well, I think one statistic that I believe is correct is, notably we've got Brigadier Allan Mallinson here, is that there are now, or going to be, more brigadiers in the British Army than there are going to be tanks, which is sort of akin to the fact that there are more admirals than there are ships. I think the government feels that the British Army is going to be too small because they have concocted a plan to replace the 20,000 soldiers they're cutting with 30,000 reservists who they're saying will be able to step into the breach and certainly carry out some or all of the likely responsibilities that those 20,000 that are going would have been able to do. Now, personally, I haven't seen any convincing description of how this will actually be materialized. The Americans, of course, it's based on the American model of having very large numbers of reservists, National Guard, being able to be called up, but they've got a very different history and background and indeed legal framework and tradition for the use of reservists, and I don't think we've got anything like that, nor do I think it's very likely we will have. So I suspect that the government wanting to have a larger armed force than it thinks it can afford or it's prepared to afford, and hoping to fill the gap with reservists, I think suggests that they think we need more people but don't quite know how to do it.
Richard Norton Taylor, what are your thoughts about the size of this new British Army?
Well, there's a huge question mark over the number of reservists that the British government hopes to attract. Allan Mallinson referred to no existential threat at the moment. I'd argue there's no... Well, the British Army is almost facing an existential crisis, actually, because what after combat troops leave Afghanistan by the end of 2014? Let's put it this way. Is there a political appetite or public appetite for sending British troops abroad in significant numbers like there have been sent to Helmand in Afghanistan? I think probably not for a very long time anyway. Just like in the future there'll be more and more emphasis on drones, for example, and precision missiles. So there'll be, if anything, in the terms of ground forces, the emphasis will be on specialist special forces. And I think at the moment the Army is the poor relation of the armed forces.
But we're not going to be able to send the amount of personnel that we're able to at the moment abroad ever again if this is a slimmed-down army, will we?
Well, you could do it, and certainly in there are different brigades. They've got armoured brigades, and they've got the Air Assault Brigade, the Airborne Brigade ready. So you could do it for a brief period, not for an enduring operation with the Army they get to have.
Colonel Richard Kemp, as a former British commander in Afghanistan, the Defence Secretary insisted that the government will not do anything to compromise the mission in Afghanistan. But with the size of these cuts, can we really believe that our troops aren't going to be affected?
Well, I think there might be an effect, and I think the effect is likely to be more on morale than anything else, because from what I can detect among soldiers who have recently come back from Afghanistan, or I talk to who are out there now, as you'd expect, there is still a very strong spirit of comradeship, very good leadership, and an excellent level of fighting spirit among the troops. But I think the wider morale of those people who are getting ready to deploy to Afghanistan, who may be going out there, is going to be affected by the fact that their regiments or corps are being dramatically reduced or cut out of the order of battle altogether. That, in many cases, they and their friends are being told they're being made redundant, and then you can add to that the erosion of terms of service and the overall kind of reduction of pay in real terms that is facing most soldiers. I think the impact is much more likely to be on morale, because the actual effect of these cuts is probably not going to come in until around about 2014, when most British forces will be out of Afghanistan.
Allan Mallinson, former brigadier-general and now defence commentator for The Times. With these cuts, there's going to be a greater reliance on reserve forces such as the Territorial Army, and also fighting alongside allies such as the United States and France. Is this going to be a good thing for the British Armed Forces?
The idea, can we mount an entirely sovereign operation such as recovery of the Falklands in the event that they were to be captured? There will be certain operations, no doubt, that the MOD is thinking about on a contingency basis, and I suspect the answer is we will retain a strong sovereign capability to do the sort of thing that we could only do by going alone. The idea of the TA, interesting historically, we've never made this work, frankly. The origin of the Territorial Army was for home defence. That's why it was called territorial. It was to defend the homeland territory. It went to France in 1914 after primary legislation had been enacted to allow it, in fact to compel it, to serve abroad. And then in the interwar years it was seen very much again in that role. It was never seen as a major way of either reinforcing the regular army or indeed taking over some of its responsibilities, except in specific areas such as air defence of Great Britain. The interesting thing about it is that if we mount an operation overseas, as we just talked about, it's fine initially. We can do it almost exclusively with regular troops, although medical support we will need to bring in reservists. If you've got 15, 16, 17,000 men deployed overseas, that's 5,000 men out of business and industry, is a lot to get employers to sign up to. And I'm not sure that employers, even once the economy starts picking up, are going to be as pro this plan as we seem to think they will be.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the impact of the British Army defence cuts. Joining me is Colonel Richard Kemp, a former British commander in Afghanistan. Richard Norton Taylor is The Guardian's defence and security writer, and Allan Mallinson is a former brigadier-general and now a defence commentator for The Times. Richard Norton Taylor?
Well, I think the government also isn't sure, and they're drawing up. Philip Hammond, the Defence Secretary, has made it quite clear that they're going to have to draw up a new statute which will put more obligations, really, on both the government, but also specific duties on employers as well as employees. And they're talking about how much easier it'll get. For example, you get communication sort of geeks from the British Telecom, which is a big company. Easier maybe to get those because they've got so many, but very difficult to get people from smaller companies or niche engineering companies, for example. The government recognises that, and they're crossing their fingers. At the moment, I mean, it seems to me that according to the latest plan or something on the Army 2020 sort of paper that came out a few days ago, that we can do a short-term expeditionary force of some significance, but not an enduring one. And Philip Hammond himself, the Defence Secretary, the other day referred to Britain being the sort of proud and sort of gutsy defence country, warrior nation, if you like, or certainly taking defence seriously.
Can we ever be that again? Can we ever be that again with this force?
Well, not alone. I mean, the French, and they respect, the French has mutual respect, I think, with the French. Philip Hammond said the other day, we will want to be in the front line of any military conflict or expedition or crisis which will affect Europe. And our European allies, he says, can help with a tail, a rather sort of put-down thing. But it's going to be coalitions of the willing, I think, in future. In NATO, how many people were signed up to the air strike and air reconnaissance surveillance no-fly zone campaign last year? Very, very few big EU countries. The Germans didn't, the Poles didn't, for example. Other big EU countries did reluctantly. Curious enough, other countries did proportionally very much more than they could be expected. Norway, for example, the Norwegian Air Force did quite a lot of bombing. They're not even members of NATO, they're not members of the EU. The NATO Secretary-General Rasmussen talks about the need, as was happening in other countries like Afghanistan and indeed Iraq, for non-European countries joining NATO-led operations, notably the Australians and New Zealanders, who provide a lot of special forces, actually, in Afghanistan, but also in Libya, of course, in a great, triumphantly, the British and the French and others, NATO indeed did a NATO-led operation in Libya, but the Qataris and UAE forces too.
Can I?
Yes.
Can I just say that I think it's interesting to look at what capability is being kept at high readiness. Yes, there is the air mobile, airborne element, light, rapidly deployable. But the thing that the Army has preserved in intact, really, is its armoured capability. It's calling its three brigades no longer armoured brigades, but armoured infantry brigades. But actually, these are heavy-hitting brigades. These are the ones on tracks, basically. Tanks, armoured infantry, fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery. And we're going to retain effectively a division of those. Now, the purpose of that is really to be able to fight with a major ally, i.e. the United States of America, on the main effort. In other words, we're not just add-ons who are there just to show the flag. We can plug in to an American corps and take part in serious, quote, heavy lifting.
Colonel Richard Kemp, we are now going to be relying heavily on the reservists and the territorial army. The British public might be a bit worried that they can't meet the same capabilities that a full-time soldier might be able to. What would you say to their worries?
I would share them. I have worked in my career quite extensively with the Territorial Army. I've worked alongside them in countries like Northern Ireland and Iraq, Afghanistan. When they fight with the regular British troops, when they operate with regular soldiers, they do an extremely good job. And generally speaking, their training is topped up so they can do so and fit in very well indeed. I've also seen occasions when you've expected large numbers of territorial soldiers to turn up, and very, very small numbers have turned up because there is no real obligation upon them to do so. If you're an American National Guardsman and you don't turn up, whether it's for training or operations, a policeman comes round to your house and arrests you, and you're then subject to criminal charges. That doesn't occur in Great Britain. There's no sanction against British reservists not turning up, no effective sanction anyway. And also, I would very much question whether very many people will sign up to this kind of thing, where they know that they could be compulsorily deployed for 6 months or however long it might be, a year perhaps, to take part in operations. I think most people who would want to do that, to subject themselves to that kind of compulsory service, would probably join the regular army. And also, as I think was Richard mentioned as well, how many employers are going to take on people who are in the territorial army, who, particularly small employers who would be horrified at the idea of one or two members of their workforce suddenly being taken away from them. Even today, we have real problems with the reservists who are voluntarily mobilised. And I was talking to somebody the other day who was volunteered to be mobilised, went to the mobilisation centre and was told that his pay would not be matched. The pay he was going to be losing would not be matched by the army, which I think was part of the original deal. So I think, for all those reasons, and no doubt many other reasons, I think there's a huge amount of work to be done. I think it's very much optimistic that this will be made to work in the way that the US National Guard system can work. And of course, optimism is not a strategy.
Allan Mallinson, this new army is going to be relying on these territorial army reservists. We are going to have a second-rate army then, aren't we?
Well, you could argue that initially what it does will be as good as it's ever done. As I said, on the fourth or fifth rotation of the troops in an enduring operation, a third of them will not be professionals. One of the things that's impressed me about this exercise is that the army, having been given the terms of reference, cut 20,000 men. How you do it is up to you. That was virtually the blank sheet of paper they were handed. They've gone about it in a very imaginative way, I think. And instead of the salami slicing approach, they have said, right, who is it who really needs to train the most? It is the infantry. It is the armoured corps, and then below that you start getting a sort of gradation of need for training, so that you could say that the man driving a fuel tanker truck does not need to be training day in, day out. And the proportionate cuts to the enabler areas are much greater than to the fighting areas. The infantry, quite rightly, have taken a smaller cut proportionately than the corps and the services. It's still taken too many, in my opinion, but that's the idea. It reduces policy options for politicians. They've got to be certain that what they get involved in is going to be over and done quickly. Now, 15 years ago, I smiled when I was still in uniform, listening to a briefing to a foreign chief of defence who'd brought over to London, and I was told how the army was planning its future arrangements, the policy being fast in, fast out. And afterwards I remember saying, fast in is merely a technical challenge. Fast out is nothing to do with you. That's your adversary, and that's your political masters. So how fast do politicians want us out, and how fast can they get us out? It's over to them.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the impact of the British Army defence cuts. Joining me is Colonel Richard Kemp, a former British commander in Afghanistan. Richard Norton Taylor is The Guardian's defence and security writer, and Allan Mallinson is a former brigadier-general and now a defence commentator for The Times. Richard Norton Taylor, is this going to be an effective, well-equipped fighting force?
Well, can I just answer this other question first?
Sure.
It's going to be, I think it's going to be not very fast in either, actually, after Afghanistan and Iraq, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, political, financial, strategic, tactical reasons. I think, I'm afraid to say, a great lover of the British Army, the Army is going to be, in a way, the poor relation I said, is going to be. Now, in America, too, people talk about, and Alan did too, about fighting maybe with an armored division with Americans. The Americans are talking now, the Pentagon, about the importance of air-sea operations, air-sea, the Pacific, Asia. Yeah. They're not talking about Europe. The Europeans have got to get a grip on life, actually, themselves. So the British and the French can do it. What about other countries on the general sort of military front? I think, the Army is going to play a lesser role. A bigger role is going to be played by drones, by fast jets, precision missiles, and in the British case, where we've got submarines and, of course, nuclear missiles, but also Tomahawk cruise missiles, and they're building 2 new very big and expensive aircraft carriers.
Colonel Richard Kemp, former British commander in Afghanistan, is this right now? This is what we're going to see. As Richard Norton Taylor said, we're going to see an increased reliance on technology and less on our army.
Well, I think we might plan to do that, and it might be people's hope that we'll do that. But ultimately, I think the kind of fighting that we're likely to have to do, and we're likely to have to play a major role in, is perhaps the sort of thing that we've seen in certainly in the post-war period, which involves getting troops on the ground, whether they're in tanks or whether they're infantrymen. And as Allan Mallinson said, and he of course was both an infantryman and an armoured corps officer, so he knows that it takes a great deal of training and expertise and experience to effectively fight this kind of conflict on the ground, face-to-face with the enemy, particularly the type of enemy that we've been facing in recent years in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, of course, if we, for some reason, had to intervene in a country like Libya, yes, you can do a certain amount from the air, you can achieve certain things with technical means, but ultimately, if there was, for example, a need to secure chemical weapons, if there was a risk of them being used or being taken by or transferred to jihadists, for example, which I think is certainly a possibility, then it would need, if there was an intervention, it would need feet on the ground. So, whatever we might want to do, I think ultimately we will have to, we should anyway, retain a pretty significant capability in both infantry, armoured corps, artillery, and engineers as well, who can actually go on the ground, do the job, hold on to ground if needed, and work against an active enemy.
There have already been concerns about British forces having enough protection and equipment in battles that they've already served in and ones we're currently in at the moment. Is this going to be even more of a problem now that we're slimming down the army?
I think, protective mobility, protective vehicles have been a long-standing problem for us, and it's partly due to an unwillingness to recognise a changed situation. For example, I think it's true that many people in the British forces clung on to the almost sort of longed to be back in Northern Ireland when they were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they wanted to use the same equipment as they had in Northern Ireland. They held on to the snatch, and partly that's a reluctance to change and accept that you're in a completely new situation. Partly, of course, it's a reluctance to invest the money in it, and then on top of that, we've seen problems with the speed of procurement and development of new vehicles that are suited to the new weapons we face and the type of terrain we're now fighting in. And a classic example of that is the Foxhound vehicle, which is just coming into service now in Afghanistan, 2 years after the decision was taken to procure that particular vehicle, and it's just coming into service. I mean, if you can imagine a similar timetable being applied to production of Spitfires or of tanks in the Second World War, the war would have been over probably long before we'd actually gotten in on the ground. I think that there has been a lack of urgency and a lack of will to invest money in new systems. I think that's only likely to continue, and we've now bought a huge number of protected vehicles for Afghanistan, and undoubtedly we'll be using those wherever we go around the world for the next probably 30, 40 years. As
we come to the end of this discussion, I want to find out from each of you what you think our new look army will look like. Colonel Richard Kemp, if I can begin with you.
My view is that the level of professionalism and the fighting spirit of the British Army has never, even for one moment, declined, despite the decline in numbers. So I think, albeit it will, if we go along, if we continue down this route, it will be a significantly smaller army. I think it will still be a very high-quality army with extremely high-quality people. And my biggest concern for it is that the standard of, particularly the standard of officer that we might be able to attract in the future could be in question because of the lack of opportunities, because of the lack of scope, and because it's being seen, the British Army is being seen today, I think, and has been seen for a number of years as a declining industry. Although I'm deeply unhappy with the level of cuts that are being made and the places they're being made within the army. and within the armed forces overall, I do think that whatever the outcome, there will be a very, very high-quality force.
Richard Norton Taylor.
I think there is a danger that the cuts will be too deep. The government says, the British government says, we will be able to maintain not an enduring operations, but a kind of a robust expeditionary force. But for how long is the question? And there's a danger that maybe it'll go beyond a tipping point, that the army will prove to be actually too small to do other than a very short, robust operation it's done in the past, and concentrate on kind of niche operations, whether it's stabilization ones, whether it's humanitarian ones with other countries, reliance on special forces, a light footprint on the ground, soft power like training people in other countries and so on. These are, by the way, these are niche operations are emphasized very, very strongly by top army officers now, including the head of the army, General Peter Wall. So I think there is a danger anyway. And the government itself, I think, is and top and senior officers at the head of the army are crossing their fingers.
And Allan Mallinson.
One of the biggest disasters the British Army ever faced was in South Africa at the turn of the 19th century, 1899, 1900, 1901, fighting the Boers. And the army found itself completely outmatched by what effectively was a militia. Many fewer men, but they knew the country. They were expert in using their weapons, mobility, and we were given a very hard time. Kipling famously wrote, "We've had no end of we've had no end of a lesson. It will do us no end of good," and it did do us no end of good, because the committees of inquiry that sat after the Boer War led to a complete reform of the army from top to bottom. It was quite extraordinary, the thoroughness. But one of the major findings of the committee of inquiry into the Boer War was that we didn't have a system of rapid expansion of the army in time of conflict. And the one thing I would really want the MOD to be doing, and okay, it probably wouldn't be able to talk about it because it would imply that they've no confidence in the plan that they've just produced. There's got to be a plan for regeneration of the army when, oblique if, this plan to rely on the TA is shown not to work. My principal other concern will be exactly the one that Colonel Richard Kemp has brought up about officer quality. Can we recruit and then can we retain officers? We've got to be able to keep high quality people right through the service. In the end, the British Army has got over its inevitable setbacks at the end of every single war it's gone into by the quality of its senior generals who have realised what had to be done and then have had the nous and the confidence to do it.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you to all of my guests: Colonel Richard Kemp, former British commander in Afghanistan; Richard Norton Taylor, The Guardian's defence and security writer; and Allan Mallinson, a former brigadier-general and now defence commentator for The Times and author of The Making of the British Army.